Pence was honored in Boston last night, receiving the John F. Kennedy Library's Profile and Courage Award. That award was designed to recognize public servants who've made courageous decisions without regard for professional or personal consequences. To tell us more, Western Mass News reporter Taylor Smith joins us live in the studio. Now, Taylor, why was the former vice president picked for this award?
Well, Sloan, former VP Mike Pence was chosen to receive this year's award due to his decision to certify the 2020 presidential election results following the January 6th riot of the U.S. Capitol. Now, despite extraordinary pressure to overturn the results of the 2020 election, this award recognizes Pence for putting his life and career on the line to ensure the mandated constitutional transfer of presidential power. Now, JFK's daughter, Carolyn Kennedy, and her son, Jack, released a statement ahead of the ceremony saying despite their political differences, it's hard to imagine an act of greater consequence, which Pence acknowledged during the ceremony, saying how he was inspired by Kennedy and deeply honored to receive this award.
I will always believe, by God's grace, I did my duty that day to support the peaceful transfer of power under the Constitution of the United States of America.
Profile in Courage Award was first created in 1989, and previous recipients of this award include former President Barack Obama in 2017 and former U.S. Representative Gabby Giffords in 2013. Reporting live in the studio, Taylor Smith, Western Mass News.
Thank you, Taylor, for that live report.